Good evening. I am Leslie Ginsberg-Klein, the Dean and Chief Academic Officer of Gratz College, and I'm honored to welcome you all to the annual Elizabeth T. and Abram P. Piwosky Memorial Lecture. The origin of the Elizabeth T. and Abram P. Piwosky Memorial Lecture is rooted in an encounter that took place over 100 years ago at a party convened by Hatikva juniors and hosted at Gratz College. There, Abram, then a Gratz student, and Elizabeth met for the first time. They married a few years later and started a family that has ever since been anchored in Jewish education and religious life in Philadelphia for many decades. Abram was superintendent of the Hebrew Sunday School Society, an institution formed by our very own Rebecca Gratz in 1838. When Congregation Adat Yeshurun created a new position to lead its new Hebrew school, Abram's teacher and later Gratz's president, Dr. Julius Greenstone, recommended him for the role, in which he served for 3 decades from 1925 to 1950. He was an influencer of the time, founding the Philadelphia Board of Jewish Education, the predecessor of the Auerbach Central Agency for Jewish Education, now known as Jewish Learning Venture. He held officer roles within the United Synagogue, Camp Ramah, Salman Schachter Day School, B'nai B'rith, and of course, Gratz College. Elizabeth Piwosky was also an influential Jewish educator and community leader. She taught kindergarten at that same Hebrew Sunday School Society and founded the Volunteers Program at the Federation of Jewish Agencies, now the Federation of Greater Philadelphia. She also helped lead the Jewish Soldiers Canteen at the Jewish Welfare Board. Through their leadership within the arena of Jewish education, Abram and Elizabeth Piwosky remained deeply committed to Gratz College. Abe was a longtime member and past secretary of the Gratz Board of Overseers and received the Alumni Award for devotion to the college and its Alumni Association in 1947, was recognized for outstanding contribution to Jewish life in 1955, and was honored with the Gratz Community Award in 1968. Given the times, it is very likely these awards were in fact meant to acknowledge both Abe and Elizabeth's outstanding leadership. In 2021, this lecture was endowed by their daughters, Nona Levin Abrams, may her name be for a blessing, and Joan P. Wohl, who we are honored to have with us tonight. Also joining us tonight is the Piwosky's grandson, Jonathan Levin, who currently serves on the Gratz Board of Governors as co-vice chair. All are exemplars of Jewish education and committed leaders of the Philadelphia Jewish community. Their decision to partner with Gratz College to support scholarship in the field of Jewish education carries forward a legacy that has stretched for more than a century. It traces back to a Zionist young people's gathering that blossomed into a multi-generational commitment to advancing and energizing Jewish education in Philadelphia and beyond. During the lecture, if you have any questions for the Q&A, do not put them in the chat. The chat is not working. Please put them in the Q&A, which can be found either on the bottom tab of your Zoom screen or by clicking the More button on the toolbar of your Zoom screen. Now I am pleased to introduce this year's annual Elizabeth T. and Abram P. Piwosky Memorial Lecture, Dr. Lindsay Katzir. Dr. Lindsay Katzir is the Assistant Director of Jewish Studies at Gratz College, where she also teaches as Assistant Professor of Jewish Literature. She has a PhD in English and was previously an Assistant Professor of English and a Writing Center Director. Her research focuses on British literature, with a particular emphasis on the Victorian era and especially on 19th century Jewish leadership. She is also the co-editor of the Victorian Jewish Writers Project, an open access archive on Jews and Judaism in the long 19th century. She is the author of numerous articles on British Jewry and is currently completing a monograph entitled The Religious Thought of Anglo Jewry, 1782 to 1926. Dr. Katzir has not been on the staff of Gratz College for long, but she has already made incredible contributions to Gratz and to our students, and it is an absolute pleasure to work with her every day. I'm honored now to introduce Dr. Lindsay Katzir.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Klein, for that wonderful introduction. Yes, I have not been with Gratz for very long. Actually, today it's been 7 months exactly, but I feel like it's been much longer. It's certainly been one of the top two most gratifying experiences of my professional career. So I want to thank the Gratz College leadership for inviting me to give this talk tonight, and to thank you all for coming. All right, I'm going to share my slides. All right, I hope everyone can see them okay. If not, just let me know. So my talk tonight on the theme of education is called Nathan Marcus Adler, Grace Aguilar, and the Reimagining of Jewish Education in Victorian Britain. This lecture will have about 4 parts. I'm first going to talk about the context for Jewish education in 19th century Britain, and then I'm going to talk about two different but interesting and related figures, Chief Rabbi Nathan Marcus Adler and Grace Aguilar, and then to close, I will draw some connections to the Philadelphia community and to Gratz College. Throughout the 19th century, Jewish education in Britain was unorganized and ineffective for a few major reasons. For one, educational opportunities for the lower classes especially were limited. Christian missionary groups took advantage of the inadequacy of communal provision for the education of the poor by establishing free schools in or near Jewish neighborhoods in the East End. Poorer children were sometimes persuaded to attend these schools because teachers offered them food and clothing. Jewish communal leaders recognized that without formal schooling, lower class Jewish children were vulnerable to those conversionist pressures. This concern led to the establishment of communal schools that combined secular and religious instruction. The largest is the Jews' Free School, which opened in 1817. This was first established in 1783 as the Talmud Torah of London's Great Synagogue. It provided large numbers of poor children with a rudimentary secular and religious education. However, it has been said students generally emerged with a limited knowledge of either. Second, intercommunal differences prevented the formation of organized schooling for the upper classes. Most of the community agreed on the need for free schools for the poor, but they agreed on little else. The Orthodox sought to establish a private Jewish day school in London, believing that it could provide comprehensive religious instruction, ensure ritual observance, and strengthen their children's commitment to Judaism. However, the less observant favored limiting religious instruction, and they were largely unconcerned with their children's lack of familiarity with Jewish rituals and texts. They also rejected proposals for a private Jewish day school, arguing that such an institution would attract unwanted attention and hinder efforts toward full emancipation and integration into British society. And just to note that Jews were not fully emancipated, and fully emancipated until about the 1870s. So this was a real concern for the community at this time. These disagreements over religious distinctiveness and communal identity frequently produced open conflict. While some were content with completely secular curricula, others stressed the importance of religious education, especially amid mounting concerns about assimilation. Well-to-do Orthodox Jews were often unwilling to enroll their sons in elite public schools where Christian practices were built into daily life, and adherence to Kashrus, Shabbos, Yom Tov proved difficult. Hyman Hurwitz, a Talmudist and scholar from Posen, founded the first Jewish boarding school in Britain in 1799. His curriculum included both secular and Jewish subjects. Leopold Newmegen, a Hebraist and educator who was also from Posen, became headmaster of Hurwitz's school in 1821, and the school remained open until his death in 1875. But there were really not that many boarding schools. Um, Hoping to provide a Jewish alternative to the Christian public schools, Chief Rabbi Nathan Marcus Adler opened a public day school for middle-class boys in 1855. This school offered instruction in religious and secular subjects. It unfortunately failed to attract broad support and closed in 1879, but I will be talking about this school momentarily. Journalists and other public figures regularly criticized the state of Jewish education in Britain. In 1844, Joseph Mitchell and Marcus Breslau, the editors of the new periodical called the Jewish Chronicle, called for stronger Jewish education to prevent the dilution of Judaism in response to contemporary pressures. In their view, the emerging reform movement could steer Jews away from traditional practice. This was a concern of theirs, with the reform movement having really ripped the community apart in the early 1840s. In 1845, a writer for the periodical The Voice of Jacob likewise attributed widespread ignorance of Judaism across the community to ineffective communal education. Religious instruction for the masses, they argued, largely consisted of reading prayers in Hebrew and translating them into English, while institutions such as the Jews' Free School relied heavily on rote learning. As a result, many British Jews could recite prayers, but they could not read Hebrew with understanding. Parents were usually satisfied if their children could at least recite their prayers from memory. Concerned about the future of Jewish life in Britain, intellectuals and communal leaders increasingly called for educational reform. Now, before I launch into discussing Nathan Marcus Adler, I just wanted to share a couple of slides with you all. This is not a comprehensive list of all the schools that existed in Britain in the 19th century. It's just the ones I could find the most information on and the ones that were the most well known, and some of which still exist today. Most notably the Jews' Free School, which, although it's moved locations, does still exist today. A couple of schools, including the Sephardic schools, sort of were absorbed by the Bevis Marx's Hebrew School. The Bayswater Jewish schools, which opened in 1866, also still exist today, through merging and the creation of new schools. But the school that exists today does trace its origin to the Bayswater Jewish schools of the 19th century. The Stepney Jewish schools lasted for quite a long time. This was founded by Marcus Adler, who was Nathan Marcus Adler's one of his three sons. And of course, there's Hyman Hurwitz's boarding school. Hyman Hurwitz did not get to make a major appearance in this talk, but he's a really fascinating character. He was the first ever Jewish professor in Britain when he was made professor of Hebrew at University College London. And he was also the first person to to translate rabbinical texts into English. So I just wanted to throw it out there that he's a very interesting person. And also his school was not only a boarding school for boys, but had a girls' school on the premise as well. There are provincial schools, three of which still operate today in Birmingham, Liverpool, and Manchester. And then briefly, just wanted to show you all some of the subjects that were typically taught in these schools: Hebrew reading, English reading, arithmetic, geography, history, needlework and sewing for girls, sometimes commercial education for boys. And there was religious instruction, but it was not the same as the Hayter style education that you would find in Eastern Europe, for instance. Okay. During the 19th century, Anglo-Jewish Orthodoxy underwent a process of institutional consolidation that reshaped religious authority in Britain. Much of this transformation occurred under the leadership of Nathan Marcus Adler, whose chief rabbinate and later creation of the United Synagogue sought to reconcile halakhic authority with the expectations of Victorian society. Born in Hanover in 1803, Adler followed his father into the rabbinate and became chief rabbi of Hanover in 1830. However, it was his election as chief rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the British Empire that would truly define his career. Until Adler, Solomon Herschel, as the head of London's Great Synagogue, functioned as the community's unofficial chief rabbi. After his death in 1842, the Ashkenazi congregations held their first formal election for chief rabbi in 1844, electing Adler by an overwhelming majority. In the decades that followed, Adler transformed the chief rabbinate into the principal authority of 19th century British Orthodoxy. So by the time he became chief rabbi in the 1840s, Jews in Britain were fairly acculturated, and they saw Adler as particularly capable of balancing adaptation and continuity. He represented a new kind of rabbi, one who was university educated, but who was also strictly Orthodox. Adler envisioned a modern Anglo-Jewish orthodoxy that reconciled British cultural norms with the requirements of Jewish law. For him, maintaining orthodoxy in an acculturating community required the centralization of religious authority under his chief rabbinate. And this approach was part of a larger program of communal reform, particularly in three areas: synagogue practice, philanthropy, and education. His reform program began with a comprehensive survey of congregational practices initiated shortly after his induction. This survey found that observance of Orthodox practice was lax, synagogue attendance was poor, and the educational facilities were sadly deficient across London's major Ashkenazi congregations and 21 provincial communities. So, in response, Adler published laws and regulations for all Ashkenazi synagogues in the British Empire in 1847, with particular attention to improving the religious education of children. Education was Adler's foremost concern. He saw Jewish learning as the basis of communal renewal and the surest means of preserving halakha. Ignorance of Judaism, he warned, posed a greater threat to orthodoxy than any external forces. Education was therefore not merely a communal necessity, but a spiritual safeguard. This is a photo of the Jews' Free School with a really wonderful and funny quote from Israel Zangwill. Adler's emphasis on education coincided with the growing prominence of the Jews' Free School. What began as the Great Synagogue's Talmud Torah by the late 19th century had become one of the largest primary schools in the United Kingdom. The 20th century historian of British Jewry, Cecil Roth, has a really funny way of describing what education was like or in the 18th century. I'm just going to read it because it amuses me. Hitherto, the only provision for education in London Jewry, other than a host of private teachers, had been the Talmud Torah established in connection with the Great Synagogue, a rudimentary day school presided over by a Melamed of the old type, frequently ignorant and uncouth, who confined his teaching to Hebrew and the mechanical translation of the Bible into Yiddish. So by 1815, largely through the efforts of Dr. Joshua Van Oven, who was an educational activist, plans were underway to transform the school into a modern educational institution that could serve as a Jewish alternative to the conversionist schools and reduce the appeal of their incentive. So the Jews' Free School opened in 1817 as a result of these efforts. The school did not achieve its later prominence until the tenure of Moses Angel, who has been described as the single most significant figure in Anglo-Jewish religious and secular education in the 19th century. Angel was headmaster from 1842 to 1897, and thus he led the school for the whole of Adler's chief rabbinate. By 1870, it had 2,700 pupils, all being taught free of charge. A third of London's Jewish children at the time of this tenure are said to have passed through, and this was at a time when London's Jewish population was growing rapidly. At one time, the Jews' Free School had about 4,200 children on their roll. Angel's educational philosophy closely paralleled Adler's, especially in its emphasis on Anglicization. Institutions like the Jews' Free School wanted to eliminate Yiddish, but preserve a strong Jewish identity and at least a nominal Orthodox practice. Adler took a personal interest in the school He visited early in his tenure and campaigned to improve its facilities. Within about a decade, he reported that roughly half of all Jewish children in Britain were receiving some kind of Jewish education. Yet Adler still found the community's educational system lacking. He envisioned a comprehensive system beginning with the youngest children and culminating in the training of capable instructors. The effort, he explained, must begin with educational establishments, from those which are calculated for infants up to such as are extended their salutary influence to the future by training proper and efficient teachers. To that end, he called for a training college for ministers and teachers. He also proposed a day school for middle-class Jewish boys. He realized this vision with the founding of Jews College in 1855, an institution intended not only to train competent ministers, not rabbis. That's a linguistic distinction that actually has meaning, and you're welcome to ask me about it in the Q&A. Ministers and educators, but also to standardize religious instruction across Anglo-Jewry. The college included a base medrash, while its associated day school, Jewish College School Finsbury, provided a model for middle-class Jewish education. The significance of this initiative was immediately recognized, with the Jewish Chronicle writing dramatically, thus ended the most important meeting ever held by the Jews of England. For Adler, education was not only a matter of schools and institutions, but of belief. In a sermon titled The Jewish Faith, delivered on January 29, 1848, he returns to what he had already identified as a widespread problem, that many Jews lacked even a basic knowledge of Jewish doctrine. Others he saw as denying those tenets. Using a verse from Ecclesiastes, he set out the central tenets of the faith in an effort to restore both understanding and commitment. Adler begins by presenting the transmission of Judaism as a parental obligation. In defending the authority of divine revelation, he argues that the testimony of ancestors carries special weight precisely because of the parental relationship. The truths of Judaism, he explains, were testified by our ancestors, by our parents, who possessed not only knowledge, but a parental interest and desire not to mislead us, but to direct and to give us the best advice, the best inheritance. What matters here is not only the content of that inheritance, but the relationship through which it is passed. Parents function as custodians of the faith, responsible for preserving and transmitting it faithfully to the next generation. He then identifies this obligation within the commandments themselves. When Adler catalogs the mitzvahs, he moves from love of God to love of family and community and explicitly invokes the biblical injunction to teach these laws to one's children. Instruction is not an auxiliary practice. It is central to the religious system. At the same time, he portrays Judaism as a living inheritance sustained across generations, describing it as the faith for which many thousands of our ancestors, from their cradle to their grave, gladly sacrificed all that is sweetest. With the phrase "from their cradle," Adler emphasizes that Judaism is received from birth, formed in childhood, and carried forward continuously. The sermon concludes with a prayer that these fundamental articles of our faith may never depart from our mind and heart and spirit, coupled with a call to rouse those who are indifferent and rekindle the fire in those that are cold. Faith, in this formulation, is not only taught but cultivated. It must engage both intellect and emotion if it is to endure. The Jews' college-based Midrash and day school were short-lived and soon closed, but the college itself flourished. In 1881, it relocated closer to University College London, which allowed students to combine religious study with university degrees. And it actually survives today as the London School of Jewish Studies, which trains teachers and preserves Adler's educational vision. Okay, I'll now turn to Grace Aguilar. I just wanted to share with you all a list of some of her major works, and you can always check out my digital archive if you would like to actually see some of these works. So, as we have seen, concerns about Jewish education often arose in response to external pressures. I mentioned earlier that missionary groups sought to convert Jews to Christianity through their educational initiatives, and they often targeted women and children who were less likely to receive formal instruction in Jewish texts and traditions. Aguilar responded directly to these challenges. In works like The Spirit of Judaism, The Peres Family, The Women of Israel, and The Jewish Faith, Aguilar emphasizes the central role of education in sustaining identity and continuity. Aguilar was born on June 2nd, 1816, in Hackney, London, to Sephardi parents, Emmanuel and Sarah Aguilar. During her childhood, the family attended Bevis Mark Synagogue, London's oldest Sephardi congregation, where her father briefly served as Parnas. In 1828, Emmanuel contracted tuberculosis, prompting the family to relocate to Devon for his health. Aguilar herself experienced recurring illness, having survived a serious childhood condition and later contracting the measles at 19. She spent much of her time away from London's Jewish community, and so she attended some church services with Christian friends because she had a desire for communal worship. But she remained a devoted student of Jewish texts and religion throughout her life. In 1840, her family returned to London, settling once again in Hackney. By this time, Aguilar had already completed several manuscripts and began corresponding with figures such as Isaac Disraeli and Isaac Leeser to secure publishers in Britain and the United States. Both of her parents were frequently ill, so she was largely responsible for supporting her household. By 1842, she was earning a steady income through her writing. Over the course of her career, she published about 12 books across multiple genres, fiction, theology, devotional literature, and she also ran a boarding school for Jewish boys with her mother. The school was located in Hackney, and it was called Mrs. and Miss Aguilar's Preparatory Establishment for Young Gentlemen. It offered instruction in English, Hebrew, religion, writing, arithmetic, geometry, and history. Aguilar proposed several solutions to the educational shortcomings I discussed at the beginning of this lecture. First, she insisted that Jewish institutions use English for the benefit of those not fluent in Hebrew. In The Spirit of Judaism, which presents a series of interpretations deriving religious and ethical lessons from phrases of the Shema, she argues that holy work should be printed in vernacular languages. Traditionally, Jewish texts were written in Hebrew or Aramaic and remained accessible primarily to the educated. Aguilar advocated making them available to all Jews. She was also influenced by evangelical emphases on simple personal piety, and she adopts that language when she claims the Hebrew poor need religion, simple, heartfelt, yet ever-guiding religion, and this can only be obtained by teaching them their English Bibles. So for Aguilar, the Bible formed the basis of Jewish education, and in England, where Hebrew literacy was low, that meant providing English Bibles as Christians did. In The Jewish Faith, which presents a series of fictional letters explaining the central tenets of Judaism, she contrasts contemporary Jewish education with Christian education, noting that Christian children had access to numerous resources, writers, both men and women, published educational works, churches employed clergymen to provide free instruction. Jewish children, by contrast, had far fewer opportunities. As she explains, there is only one synagogue in the metropolis where every Sabbath there are sermons in the vernacular idiom, tending to remove doubt, answer inquiry, satisfy feeling, and confirm belief. This is most likely a reference to Bevis Marks, which introduced regular weekly English sermons in 1833. So from Aguilar's perspective, without accessible resources in vernacular languages, Jewish children who were less educated in religion than their Christian peers might turn to Christian sources for guidance. So she calls for Jewish writers to produce educational works for Jewish children. The Jewish Faith is her own example. Another example is her story, The Peres Family, a didactic story that she contributed to Charlotte Montefiore's Cheap Jewish Library, which ran for about a decade, most of the 1840s. This was an educational periodical founded in part to counter evangelical conversionism. In addition to her emphasis on English, Aguilar identifies a second antidote to declining religious knowledge in the development of Hebrew fluency. In The Spirit of Judaism, she condemns the rote teaching of Hebrew, the common method of instruction at the time. She worried that conversionists might exploit the ignorance of Jews who possessed only a superficial knowledge of the Hebrew tongue. She therefore suggests that children develop native fluency in Hebrew. She envisions a future in which Jews of all nations can speak Hebrew conversationally, claiming this end cannot be attained if the Hebrew child is merely taught to read and translate his prayers, as was formerly the case, and his aptitude in the language judged according to his proficiency in following the synagogue service. Aguilar believed that increased Hebrew fluency would strengthen Jewish children's sense of communal identity. She rejected rote learning because she associated religious literacy with emotional identity. If Jewish children cannot read Hebrew and do not value the routine rituals, their required daily prayers will seem meaningless to them. Concerned with safeguarding Jewish life for future generations, her educational program cultivates an emotional connection to the Hebrew Bible as Judaism's central text, treating it as the primary focus in relation to rabbinical literature. In this, Aguilar may have been influenced by evangelical emphases on scripture or by Sephardi emphases on the Hebrew Bible and legal codes alongside Talmudic learning. Aguilar believed that adherence to religious formalities without emotional conviction would eventually alienate Jews from both their culture and religion. For my final comments on Aguilar, I want to briefly mention her program for girls' education, which was her primary concern and reflects her broader aim of providing Jewish women and girls with educational materials that engage and uplift the spirit. Aguilar herself received both religious and secular instruction, which was unusual for several reasons. In Victorian Britain, where boys' education was prioritized, girls typically received only limited and irregular intellectual training, whether from tutors, governesses, or sporadic attendance at school. Instead, girls and young women generally learned accomplishments such as music or needlework or household skills, depending on their class, with the expectation that these would prepare them for marriage. This was especially pronounced among Jews, where girls' formal education remained rare well into the 20th century. Boarding schools, save that one exception that I mentioned earlier, Hyman Hurwitz's boarding school, there were almost no boarding schools for girls at this time. So the families either educated them at home or sent them to other kinds of private schools. And actually, the Bayswater Synagogue began as a girls' school. It's not exclusively a girls' school anymore, but it began as one. So Aguilar's most sustained intervention in Jewish education is her call for vernacular religious literature directed specifically at girls. Following the Perez family, she increasingly argued that while Jewish boys had access to Hebrew learning, teachers, and theological texts, Jewish girls lacked even the most basic instructional resources in English. In works such as The Jewish Faith and The Spirit of Judaism, she responds to this absence by producing accessible religious writings modeled on contemporary Christian didactic literature. These texts aim to provide clear, emotionally resonant instruction in biblical principles for an audience excluded from formal study. At the center of this program is the figure of the mother as the primary religious instructor. Aguilar presents maternal teaching not as supplementary, but as the foundation of Jewish continuity. In The Spirit of Judaism, she emphasizes the moral and emotional authority of the mother, while the Jewish faith dramatizes this role through intergenerational relationships between female mentors and younger women. Aguilar locates the success of religious education in affect rather than in formal learning alone, arguing that emotional attachment to Judaism cultivated within the home ensures lasting commitment. This emphasis reflects both Victorian gender ideology and her pedagogical aims. Mothers transmit a religion of the heart that renders ritual meaningful and sustains identity across generations. Aguilar saw the Jewish faith as an ideal example of the kind of vernacular educational text she believed was needed, and she sent a copy to Nathan Marcus Adler for review. Adler replied with thanks in a letter dated November 22nd, 1846. Although their direct correspondence appears limited, both Adler and Aguilar corresponded extensively with Isaac Leeser and Rebecca Gratz, two central figures in the development of American Jewish education. Adler and Aguilar influenced Leeser and Gratz's educational initiatives, and Leeser and Gratz, who established the Hebrew Sunday School of Philadelphia in 1838, are most well known for this work today. And I'm going to conclude now for the next couple of minutes talking about some of these transatlantic connections. Isaac Leeser was an American Orthodox leader, teacher, scholar, and publisher. He is best known today for serving as the Chazan of Congregation Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia, as well as for his publishing and educational initiatives. Less well known is his extensive correspondence with Nathan Marcus Adler, who acted as informal consultant, advising him on finding qualified Hebrew teachers as well as pulpit scholars. These letters show Adler's significant influence on Leeser, including his views on modern orthodoxy and centralized leadership. Under Adler's Jews College inspired Leeser to found Maimonides College in 1867, the first Jewish theological seminary in the United States. Leeser viewed Jews College as a successful English-speaking model that he sought to replicate in America. Although it closed in 1873, Maimonides College paved the way for future Jewish seminaries in the United States. Leeser's letters to Adler also frequently updated him on the Hebrew Education Society of Philadelphia, which provided religious and secular instruction to Jewish children, and the two discussed a lack of suitable English language materials. Likewise, Leeser had a long and productive relationship with Aguilar. His journal, The Occident, an American Jewish Advocate, featured over 30 of her poems, and she was listed as one of his highest paid contributors. The Jewish Publication Society that Leeser founded, the predecessor of today's Jewish Publication Society of America, published at least 3 of Aguilar's educational tracts. There was also likely some mutual influence. Leeser delivered English language sermons as early as 1830, published educational works in English throughout his career, and produced an English Tanakh in 1853. So the two of them shared many of the same educational aims and values and influenced one another's work. I hardly need give details on Rebecca Gratz to this crowd, but I will mention that Leeser also introduced Aguilar to Miriam and Solomon Cohen of Savannah, Georgia, which began a fruitful correspondence between them. Miriam Cohen was the niece of Rebecca Gratz. When Cohen wrote to Aguilar in praise of the spirit of Judaism in 1842, the two women began a correspondence that continued until Aguilar's death, after which Sarah Aguilar, Aguilar's mother, continued to write to Cohen until 1853. Miriam Cohen's husband, Solomon, became Aguilar's chief American distributor. Gratz not only used Aguilar's texts as teaching materials in her Sunday school, but she also cited Aguilar as an inspiration for her decision to refuse marriage in order to continue her work. Aguilar was unmarried. She included the spirit of Judaism in the Hebrew Sunday School's curriculum as a vernacular defense of Judaism, and by 1845, it was the most popular book in the school's library. Gratz thought so highly of the chapter on children's education, the one that I cited in this talk, that she gave copies to her friends, and a female student received her own copy of the book as a reward for her performance in her Purim exams. In 1847, the year of Aguilar's death at 31, Gratz wrote, "Miss Aguilar stands at the head of the present race of literary Jews. Her work took possession of our minds and hearts, raising them above the earth and its cares, and fixed them on the way that leads to heaven." And just a couple of interesting images for you as I conclude. So together, Nathan Marcus Adler and Grace Aguilar identified education as the central means of sustaining Jewish life in 19th century Britain. Adler approached this task through institutions. He sought to standardize instruction and reinforce observance across the community. Aguilar addressed the gaps those institutions left behind, producing accessible religious literature and redefining the home as a primary site of instruction. Their efforts reflect a shared concern with continuity, emphasizing that education must cultivate not only knowledge, but also emotional connection if it is to endure. This extended beyond Britain through transatlantic networks of correspondence, publication, and educational reform. So that brings me to the conclusion of my talk, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have on this topic or any burning question you have about the Jews of England.
Thank you so much, Dr. Katzir. And I'm Dr. Brendan Goldman. I am the Dr. Saul P. Wax Chair of Jewish Life and Learning at Gratz College and the Director of Jewish Studies. I would like to echo both um, uh, Leslie's comments about the asset that Lindsay has been for Gratz, the remarkable asset she's been for Gratz and for Jewish Studies at the college in her relatively brief time here, and my unending gratitude for the role that she's played, as well as thanks to the broader Piwosky family for their support of this lecture series, and my friend Jonathan Levin, especially who has been an advocate from early on. So welcome everyone, and I hope you enjoyed that lecture as much as I did. I see we already have some questions coming in. Please use the Q&A to submit questions. So I'm going to selfishly, well, I'm going to open with Jonathan, and then I have a question of my own. Jonathan asks, what is the difference between minister and rabbi, and does that distinction exist in the UK today?
Okay, does it exist in the UK today? I'm gonna be honest and say I don't know because my my interest in British Jewry actually pretty much ends with the death of Israel Zangwill in 1926. But I will say, why did they have this distinction in the 19th century? It's mostly because of Adler. Um, Adler did not see the role of rabbi in the same way that it would have been seen in the continent and historically. He wanted to train ministers, and he deliberately called them ministers because much of his program to reform Orthodox practice in the 19th century revolved around mimicking certain elements of the Church of England and Christianity in a superficial way. I would say he's not doing anything inappropriate, but so they were called ministers in the Church of England, and he called them ministers. He was the only one who could be called rabbi. Which caused drama, I'll be honest, because there were some people who had smicha from before they immigrated to England. They wanted to be called rabbi, and he was not into it. Um, but they had a different job. As ministers of synagogues, their roles were pastoral rather than as scholars. So that's sort of the origin of that distinction.
I'm going to selfishly take my prerogative as moderator and ask you about Aguilar's, as all good academics, ultimately recentering ourselves and our research interests. So I was going to ask you about Aguilar's Sephardic background and the extent to which, most of the advocacy work that you mentioned she was involved in terms of education was, I think, cross-communal, but it sounded like there were distinct communal institutions that existed educationally and otherwise for the two communities. So to what extent did her efforts, bridge those communities? To what extent was her Sephardic identity something that, was a sort of an operative influence in her life and work, and how did that manifest?
So this is a really interesting time for British Jewry because the 19th century saw a lot of not all, but a lot of distinctions between Sephardi and Ashkenazi fall by the wayside. So Aguilar was and Adler too, they were both interested in having institutions where all parties would feel comfortable. So Aguilar, especially, yes, she was Sephardic, and there is research out there, including my own work, that describes a lot of how her approach to Judaism and her approach to education and Jewish learning is informed in some ways by her Sephardi background and the fact that her family had roots in the Inquisition. Um, However, she does say in her magnum opus, The Women of Israel, that the Jews of England need to move beyond these distinctions. And she's not suggesting to let go of those cultural practices or cultural languages, but to recognize that England was actually really unique in the Jewish world in that there actually was a substantial Sephardi and a substantial Ashkenazi population, and they all had to work together. A lot of the institutions were combined. So does that make sense? That I think she is informed by her Sephardi background in a lot of ways, but her writing is actually to a general Jewish audience.
No, it makes a lot of sense. It actually reminds me of Seattle because that's in the early history of the Seattle community. So that's really fascinating. So I'm reading from Rebecca Nesvet. You note that several of the British Jewish schools were founded in the late 1830s through mid 1850s, and as you say, Adler advocated engagement with modern society while maintaining halakha, and published his laws in 1847, while Aguilar was inspired in part by Christian pedagogy. So this advancement of Jewish formal education just happened at the same time as peak moral force Chartism, or did Jewish pedagogues like Adler and Aguilar engage with Chartist promotion of mass education?
Of course, Rebecca. Well, number one, thank you for coming. And number two, I can't really answer that. Not being an expert in Chartism, I cannot really answer that question in the way that you probably want. I will say that from the community's perspective, the rise of schools in this period of time had a lot to do with influence from the evangelical revival of the late 18th century and the early 19th century. That's when you get the Society for Promoting Christianity Among the Jews is the most active, and other similar societies where they did a lot of proselytizing in Jewish neighborhoods. So, at least as far as my research goes, I see less to do with British politics, and anyone's can feel free to dispute me on that, but I see more internal impetus to create these schools because they're seeing these conversionists come into their neighborhood and evangelize, and a lot of the schools were established as a way of combating that, and it happened to be that some of that missionary activity, well, the most of it occurred in the early 19th century, and that's what led to the establishment of a lot of those schools.
Fascinating. Just a reminder, everyone, please submit your questions via the Q&A uh, tab. Heather notes that's a lot for someone like Aguilar to accomplish by 31, especially since she was ill over much of her life, which is a great point as well. How did she die?
Yeah, so she had a spinal illness from an early age, and I think she just died from that, or complications from the multiple medical issues that she had. She went to Frankfurt. Also, I think she was exhausted because, like I mentioned in the talk, both her parents were also sick. Her father had tuberculosis, her mother was sick. She had two younger brothers, but they were away. They didn't participate in supporting the family. It really just fell to her. She wrote very prolifically, and she also ran the boarding school with her mother. So I think a combination of the illnesses she already had, coupled with exhaustion, and in the last year of her life, she went to visit one of her brothers in Germany and tried taking the waters as people did back then, which was not effective, and that is where she died.
It does make one feel old. Um, uh, Tammy Peterson notes it was a brilliant talk. I agree. Can you talk a little bit more about the correspondence between Aguilar and Isaac Disraeli, the future Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli's father? And hopefully the inflection conveyed the question mark in that also.
Yeah. So actually, there's a new article. I did not write it, but there's a new article that came out in last year's edition of the journal called Women's Writing that actually goes into depth about their correspondence. So I would definitely, you can feel free to ask me, I'll give you the title, but that's the name of their journal. But most of it was, Aguilar was an opportunist. She was a career woman, and most of the letters were asking to hook her up with publishing help. Isaac Leeser was very well known for his writing by her lifetime, and he actually put her in touch with the publishing house that published the vast majority of her work for the British market. Oh, and Disraeli, she also knew Disraeli. I don't know the extent to which she knew Benjamin Disraeli, but I know that he carried some of her correspondence to his father.
Okay. Um, Another one of Gratz's own, Professor Joe Davis, said, "Great talk. Was wondering if you knew anything about the Jewish boarding schools. One of my great grandfathers went to Solomon's boarding school in Edmonton."
Yes, that's really cool, Joe. Thank you so much for asking that question. So there were only a couple, like I said, and I know a lot more about Hyman Hurwitz's boarding school because I have a particular love for Hyman Hurwitz, who is a really interesting character and is definitely worth being the subject of his own talk. So I don't really know that much about Solomon's boarding school in Edmonton. Is there anything specific about the boarding schools you want to know? Those were just the only two that I that are well known. And they also provided a lot of the kinds of education that I mentioned in one of my slides, rudimentary religious instruction, and then some of those subjects like math, history, geography, and things like that.
Great. Jonathan has a follow-up. Did Aguilar face resistance from the traditional educated Jewish community when she pressed to introduce holy texts in the vernacular?
So her relationship to the, it's interesting. I may be vaguely alone in this. It's one of my primary scholarly interventions. A lot of the literature on Aguilar um, classifies her as an adherent of the early reform movement, which I strenuously disagree with because if you actually look at the theology of her work, which I'm doing in my forthcoming book, um, she mostly advocates for a very traditional view of Judaism. However, some of these superficial reforms she did also advocate for. She did experience some resistance, but it was like gentle resistance. What's really interesting about the publication of The Spirit of Judaism, this book, it literally got lost at sea. When she sent it by ship to Philadelphia for Isaac Leeser to publish, it literally got lost at sea. And so she had to completely rewrite it. And then whenever it was published, this is sort of like famous in the Aguilar lore, but if you look at the version that you can find on my archive, Isaac Leeser has made helpful marginal notes that they don't necessarily disagree on traditionalism, but you can tell that he is, if not resistant, at least concerned that her advocacy for things like centering the Bible over rabbinical texts, vernacular use of holy texts, you can tell that he's a little bit anxious about it. He will sort of temper those thoughts by saying, but it's also important that as we are the inheritors of the Holy Tongue, that we continue to print things in Hebrew and that we know Hebrew. And so yes. So I would say she did face not resistance, but definitely pushback.
And how do the politics of Yiddish language publications feature that conversation?
I don't feel like they did at this time because most of the texts that I'm working with in my book project and that we have on the Victorian Jewish Writers Project are in English because it's not that they didn't speak Yiddish or use Yiddish, but even Israel Zangwill, who spoke Yiddish fluently, wrote in English. So that has never come up that I have noticed.
That's really interesting. It's really interesting. Okay, one more question, please. Again, if anyone else has further questions, write into the Q&A. Talia Avrami writes, what did summer camps, schools, education programs look like for Jewish pupils enrolled in these schools you mentioned? Were these separate institutions from the schools, yeshivot, you
Mm.
mentioned, or just extensions?
Thank you for coming, Talia. And to answer your question, most of the schools, I'm going to answer this by talking. So for one thing, there were not like a lot of external programs. I mean, a lot of the poor children also had to help, with the upkeep of their families at this time. So they were, I mean, just like any Victorian kid, they were like lucky to be able to go to school. Um, so as I mentioned in one of my slides, the style of religious education in these schools was not the same as you would encounter in traditionalist communities in Eastern Europe. It was very rudimentary, but it was combined. And because the network of schools was very loose, the parents who were really concerned, as I mentioned, with their children being very literate in Judaism and in Jewish texts, typically hired private tutors if they could afford it. Um, the one branch of the Rothschild family, they had a private tutor slash teacher for the whole family. He used to be Adler's secretary, and he actually lived with them and went to college with one of their sons, and he sort of would like sit with them and provide this sort of holistic. He was actually a rabbi from the continent. But yeah, so I think it was really slipshod. There was not like organized yeshivas in the way that we think of them now, or that we think of them in Eastern Europe. I hope that answers your question.
Well, I think that's the last of our questions, which is great because we are at time. But Dr. Katzir, do you have any other uh, pearls of wisdom to share before we formally close out this year's Piwosky Lecture? And you know, if you
Yeah, I would just say that, my passion for Anglo Jewry really comes from the fact that I feel like it's sort of unsung in Jewish studies. You don't see this history spoken about that frequently. Like every time I go to the Association for Jewish Studies conference, there's really only maybe 5 papers of hundreds that even mention the British, and oftentimes it's not the British Jews, it's people like Charles Dickens or George Eliot or Benjamin Disraeli, or people who either, in Disraeli's case, who was like Jewish but also a Christian, and then non-Jewish writers who wrote about Jews. And I would just say that this is a really robust, informative period and place in Jewish history. And so I really appreciate you all taking an interest in learning a little bit about it. And if you want to know more, or you have any interest in teaching any of these texts in your classes, you can always reach out to me and I'm happy to give you some guidance.
Thank you again, Dr. Katzir, and thank you again, Piwosky family, for supporting this series. Really fantastic job. Again, we're so fortunate to have Dr. Katzir at Gratz. You should all know that as the applause comes in, that Dr. Katzir will be teaching her area of expertise at Gratz this fall, part of our dramatically expanded Jewish studies offering. The first time I'm letting her free from our normal seminar trainings. So if you want to audit a course on Aguilar and other seminal Jewish female figures in British literature and so forth, that opportunity is there. So thank you all again for coming. We are so proud to be able to host Dr. Katzir and to continue to share this lecture series, and have a wonderful evening.